everyone, my name is Josefin Rosen and I am leading the Nordic AI Analytics team at SAS Institute. AI is certainly a powerful force for good, and it offers a very strong competitive edge. But as Peter Parker's Uncle Ben nicely put it, with great power comes also a great responsibility. Or as my friend, the Swedish Victor profile Pippi Longstocking says, if you are very strong, you must also be very kind. And they both indeed hit the nail right on the head here. There are so many decisions nowadays that we just expect computers to make for us. Decisions that can entirely change the direction of someone's life. And as we're moving from experimentation and isolated projects towards scaling and operationalizing AI, it has never been more important to make sure that we know how to do this in a responsible manner. That we are operationalizing responsible AI. Because responsible AI can never be an afterthought. It needs to be enabled in the AI platform. It needs to be embedded. It needs to be baked into the process. And it needs to be considered continuously throughout the AI lifecycle. And during this next 15 minutes or so, I would like to share with you my top 4 recommendations on how to do this. We all know that machine learning models, the key component of most AI applications today, learn from the available training data. So this training data really needs to reflect the reality where we intend to also use the application. And that can be a little bit challenging, especially in a time like this when we are in the middle of an ongoing pandemic where the reality is constantly changing. But to train a good model, though, is only the first step on the journey towards creating value from AI and analytics. The true value comes when we are deploying our models and start to use them in a business context. But still, it doesn't end there either, because we also need to make sure that they continue to deliver value also over time, and that they continue to create correct and relevant outputs also over time. And for that to happen, we need to have a governance framework. We need to be able to monitor our models over time, and we need to be able to replace and update and retrain our models when needed. Because if we're not successful in that department, we will simply be driving decisions based on models that no longer reflect the world we live in. Models that are causing inaccurate decisions, and soon people will lose trust to our models. Or maybe even worse, they will continue to trust the models, even if they're in fact not accurate. This picture shows how the value we get from AI and analytics is changing over time. Initially it's red, it's expensive, it is a cost that we connect to data preparation and model development. But as we put our models into production, which happens here, they are starting to pay off and they are starting to generate value. But as you can see, it doesn't last for very long, unfortunately, because if we don't have governance in place, if we're not monitoring our models, if we're not updating them or retraining them, replacing them when needed, the value will quickly start to decay. COVID changed a lot of things in a very short time. And a lot of historical data and a lot of models all of a sudden were no longer relevant. And at the same time, COVID crisis has speeded up adoption of digital technologies by several years. And we have learned during these 2 last years that we need to be able to drive decisioning at scale. And for that to work, the AI lifecycle needs to be operational in nature. And this is something that we refer to as model ops. With the solid model ops process, we can put our models in production much faster, making this red area both shorter and shallower. And as we're adding governance, as we're adding model monitoring and retraining and updating and replacing our models, we can also make sure that they continue to create value also over time. Bias is one of the key terms in the responsible AI discussion. As humans, we're all biased by nature. We all have preconceived opinions that we inherited or sort of picked up along the road, and that we use, for instance, when we make decisions based on our gut feeling. Bias is not necessarily a bad thing. They're not a problem in itself. We actually absolutely need our biases. We need generalizations in order to be able to choose between the million options around us in our environment. Without our biases, we would run out of cognitive bandwidth. I recently read that our brains every second receive 11 million pieces of information. And our brains can only process 40 out of these details consciously, which means that we are more than 99% unconscious. And that is a little bit scary, especially since some of these biases are prejudices that could be discriminating in a very negative way. And our biases, it is a fact that our biases, including then also our prejudices, very easily are transferred to the applications that we develop. And that happens to the data. Because like I said, machine learning models learn from the available training data. And this is often historical data that is based on a previous manual process where the outputs from the beginning were manually tagged by a human being. And as we train our models on this data, they will also learn our biases. And in AI business, bias in means a lot more bias out. It's one thing for an individual person to make an unfair or an incorrect decision, but as we're scaling and operationalizing AI, our AI applications can now make thousands of millions of decisions every minute. So AI is sort of acting as an amplifier here. And that is serious, because a bad prediction, that means a bad decision with real impact also in the real world. So how do we put responsible AI into action? How do we operationalize responsible AI? Well, like I said in the beginning, I would now like to share with you my top 4 recommendations on how to do this. First of all, we need to communicate and create awareness around the topic and the importance of responsible AI in our organizations. And preferably, you here work together with a team that is developing and deploying AI applications to come up with a set of practical guidelines for responsible AI. And then you treat them not as a topic, but as a key part of your AI and analytics strategy. Secondly, we need to consider diversity at every stage of the AI lifecycle. Who should own responsible AI in your organization? Well, I believe that needs to be a team effort, where diversity is a key word, where everyone brings different things to the table, and where diversity can act as a safeguard against individual biases. AI applications reflect the bias of those who built them. So if an application is developed by and based on data related to only, for instance, white, middle-aged men, then this application will automatically be tuned to work better for this group. And that is fine if the application was intended to only be used by white, middle-aged men. But if the application were intended to have a broader scope, or maybe even a different scope, then that is not a good thing. The data that the application is based on need to be representative of the intended users. We often hear about gender imbalance, and we have indeed a gender imbalance in AI, just like in many other areas. With that said, I don't mean that men or women form homogeneous groups. We're all different, right? And gender is certainly not a binary variable. But because of that, we need to consider many different aspects of diversity. We need to consider background and culture and ethnicity and skill set and knowledge and age and so on. Diverse teams are strong teams. They all bring different things to the table. They are reflecting different things in the data. They are asking different questions. They're making different mistakes instead of the opposite. And a diverse team is also better at identifying bias in the output, and that is because they have different focuses naturally. Third, we need to embed responsible AI principles throughout the AI lifecycle. Like I said before, responsible AI can never be an afterthought. It's not a simple checkbox or an assessment you do once. It's something that we need to consider continuously throughout the AI lifecycle. When European Commission earlier this year, back in April, presented their proposal for regulated AI, one of the main concerns from the field was that it could potentially slow down innovation, that all the tests and reports and documentation and assessments requested would become a bottleneck that could delay deployment. And this could definitely indeed be true, but that is if we're not realizing that we need to, like I said before, enable responsible AI in the platform. We need to embed it in the process. We need to consider it at every stage of the AI lifecycle. And this is important because it is indeed a fine balance between protecting the citizen and also keeping competitive innovation. In the beginning of my presentation, I discussed how model ops could help us scale and operationalize AI. But what is interesting is that model ops could also help us hit this third bird with the same stone, because the same governance framework that we use for operationalizing and scaling AI can also help us do this in a very responsible way. I would like to walk you through the AI lifecycle to give you an idea about what needs to be considered throughout the AI lifecycle, from the question and data all the way to decision. So let's start to the left here, because it always starts with data. Everything starts with data. And to make sure that we end up using the right data, we need to very carefully define the objective of our application. And then we need to make sure that the data we're training the models on are representative of the population where we intend to use our application. We need to explore features. We need to filter out potentially sensitive ones. We need to also look into those features that are predictive of the sensitive ones to consider if we need to filter out them as well. Of course, we also need to look into different aspects of data privacy and look into that the data is in compliance with regulatory and privacy considerations. As we move into the model development phase, where we are going to develop our machine learning models, we need to, of course, assess accuracy of the models, and we need to do that over different groups to be able to detect bias. But also, in order to be able to detect bias in the outputs and to be able to trust the models, and also to be able to dare to take responsibility for the applications, we need to understand how it works. That's how we work as humans. We need to understand how the models are making its predictions, and we also need to be able to explain our decisions on request. And you know, machine learning models, they are by definition very complex. They're often referred to as black boxes. And for instance, a deep learning algorithm can be defined by millions of parameters. And if someone is asking for a comprehensive explanation, it doesn't really make sense, and it doesn't really create any trust if we put a long list of millions of parameters in front of her or him. Luckily for us, there are today several methods and techniques that can help us with this. They are called things like PD and ICE and LIME and Shapely, and they can help us explain how the different features work together in order to create a prediction. Also for the individual user, also for the individual observation, and also for the most black boxes type of algorithms. As we then move on towards the deployment phase, where we're going to put our models in production, we need to remember that autonomy and automation, that is not the same thing. Even though the words are very similar, they don't mean the same thing. Because even if we're talking about self-learning systems here, we can't just leave them alone and expect them to behave on their own. We need to continuously monitor our models over time to make sure they are doing as intended. And when needed, we need to update our models. And this is, like I said before, key in a time like this when circumstances quickly changes, like it is during a pandemic, and when models therefore become irrelevant all of a sudden. Finally, decisions, that is where we are creating the ultimate impact and value. And here we need to continue to assess the decisions to make sure that they are fair and also reasonable over time. But what if we have created awareness? And what if we have come up with a set of practical guidelines that we are treating as a key part of our AI analytics strategy within our organization? And what if we have considered diversity all the way throughout the AI life cycle? And what if we do have a solid model ops process and we are considering responsible AI principles throughout the AI life cycle and still something goes wrong? What do we do then? Can we blame an algorithm? Of course we cannot blame an algorithm, and we all know that, because when we are investing in AI, we have a responsibility to make sure that it's ethical and that it's safe and that it's fair and that it is sustainable. And that leads us to my last recommendation. The fourth recommendation is that someone, a human being, needs to be responsible for every step of the AI life cycle. We need to work together with and alongside the machines. Together with the machines, we can form really strong, synergistic dream teams, teams that can scale and operationalize responsible AI, teams that can create both business impact and trust in systems that can react fast and accurate also in weird times like this during a pandemic. Thank you so much for listening to me today, and remember that beyond the social responsibility and the greater good, that responsible AI is actually key to successful AI adoption. AI that can create tremendous value for an organization, because responsible AI is actually really, really good for business. Thank you.